My fiancée thought I'd marry her anyway, even after the baby wasn't mine. 3 hours before the ceremony, I found the positive test. At the altar, I told 150 guests why I was leaving and who got her pregnant. 3 weeks before my wedding to Natasha, everything fell apart in the most bizarre way possible. I was sitting in our apartment, going through the final guest list when the doorbell rang. Standing there was Brooke, my fiancée's maid of honor, looking like she'd been crying for hours. Her mascara had created dark rivers down her cheeks, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her purse. She walked into our living room without saying a word, sat down on the couch, and just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I offered her water, asked if she was okay, but she just kept shaking her head. Finally, she stood up and headed toward the door. That's when she turned around and whispered something that would haunt me for months. Ask her about the baby. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and a mystery that made no sense. I called Natasha immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When she finally came home around midnight, she looked exhausted and claimed she'd been at her sister's place dealing with some family drama. I mentioned Brooke's visit, but Natasha just shrugged it off, saying her friend had been acting strange lately and probably needed professional help. The next morning, I tried calling Brooke, but her number had been disconnected. I drove to her apartment, but the landlord told me she'd moved out overnight, leaving no forwarding address. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. When I asked Natasha about finding a replacement maid of honor, she became defensive and snappy, insisting we could manage without one. 2 days later, something even stranger happened. I was at the bank handling some paperwork for our joint account when I noticed a significant withdrawal from 3 months ago that I'd never seen before. $5,000, taken out on a Tuesday afternoon when Natasha claimed she'd been at work. I called her office, and her assistant confirmed she'd taken a personal day that Tuesday. That evening, I confronted Natasha about the money. She became furious, accusing me of not trusting her and monitoring her every move. She claimed the money was for a surprise honeymoon upgrade, but something in her voice told me she was lying. The way she avoided eye contact, the nervous laugh, the way she kept touching her neck. All classic tells I'd learned to recognize from years of playing poker with my buddies. I started paying closer attention to everything. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Mysterious appointments that never appeared on her calendar. Late nights at work that her colleagues knew nothing about. The pieces of a puzzle were scattered everywhere, but I couldn't figure out what picture they were supposed to form. Then I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While doing laundry, I found a parking ticket in Natasha's jeans pocket from downtown, dated on one of her supposed late work nights. The timestamp showed she'd been parked outside an upscale apartment complex at 11 p.m., nowhere near her office building. When I mapped the address, it was in the same neighborhood where Connor Walsh, my business partner, had recently moved. Connor and I had built our marketing firm together from nothing over the past decade. He was supposed to be one of my groomsmen and give a speech at the reception. We shared everything about our lives, including details about my relationship struggles with Natasha. The idea that she might be connected to that address in some way sent my mind racing in directions I didn't want to explore. The wedding rehearsal dinner became a disaster. Natasha seemed distracted and kept checking her phone obsessively. When the wedding coordinator asked about the missing maid of honor, Natasha snapped at her so harshly that several guests turned to stare. During the dinner, I noticed she barely touched her food and excused herself to the bathroom repeatedly. Each time she came back, her eyes looked a little more red and puffy. Natasha's cousin Angela pulled me aside during cocktail hour and asked me how I was handling the whole situation. When I looked confused, she assumed I was just being private about it and mentioned how brave Natasha was for going through with the wedding despite everything that had happened. I pressed her for details, but she clammed up immediately, realizing she'd said something she shouldn't have. During the rehearsal, Connor seemed unusually nervous and kept avoiding eye contact with both me and Natasha. When we practiced the processional, he fumbled his timing so badly that we had to restart 3 times. The wedding coordinator finally moved him to a different position in the lineup, but his strange behavior continued throughout the evening. After dinner, I overheard a conversation between 2 of Natasha's work friends that made my stomach drop. They were discussing how difficult things had been for her lately, mentioning doctor appointments and emotional stress. One of them said something about supporting her through a difficult decision, but they stopped talking the moment they noticed me approaching. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Natasha tossed and turned beside me. Every few hours, her phone would buzz with text messages, and she would quickly silence it without checking who was calling. When I asked about it, she claimed it was probably her sister dealing with some family crisis, but I'd noticed her sister at the rehearsal dinner acting perfectly normal. I started thinking about all the strange coincidences and timing. Brooke's breakdown happened right after Natasha had started acting distant and secretive. The mysterious $5,000 withdrawal coincided with Connor's sudden ability to afford his expensive new apartment. The parking ticket placed Natasha in his neighborhood on a night she'd claimed to be working late. Angela's cryptic comments suggested everyone in Natasha's circle knew something I didn't. The morning of our wedding arrived, and I woke up to find Natasha already gone. Her side of the bed was cold, suggesting she'd been up for hours. I found a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd gone to the salon early and would see me at the church. But when I called the salon to confirm some detail about the timeline, they told me her appointment wasn't until noon, and it was only 8 in the morning. Instead of getting ready like a normal groom, I found myself acting like a detective. I started going through Natasha's things systematically, looking for anything that might explain the web of mysteries that had been building for weeks. In her jewelry box, hidden beneath a tangle of necklaces, I found something that stopped my heart cold, a positive pregnancy test dated 4 months ago. 4 months ago, we hadn't been intimate in weeks due to work stress and wedding planning pressures. I remembered because it had been a source of serious tension between us, leading to several arguments about intimacy and connection. But here was proof that she'd been pregnant, and the timing meant it absolutely couldn't have been mine. The test was definitely hers. I recognized her handwriting on the date label. My hands were shaking as I continued searching through her belongings. In her dresser drawer, underneath her workout clothes, I found medical paperwork from a women's clinic across town. The documents were for a procedure that had taken place 6 weeks ago, right around the time Brooke had started acting strange and distant. Everything was starting to make terrible sense. I called my best man Trevor and told him to meet me at a coffee shop downtown instead of the church. When he arrived and saw my face, he knew something catastrophic had happened. I showed him everything I'd found: the pregnancy test, the medical paperwork, the parking ticket, the bank statements. Trevor had always been the analytical type, working as a forensic accountant, and he immediately started connecting dots I'd missed. He pointed out that all of Natasha's behavior changes, the missing money, Brooke's breakdown, and Connor's nervousness all aligned with specific dates on the medical paperwork. The timeline painted a picture of an affair, pregnancy, and termination that had been carefully hidden from me while I planned our wedding in complete ignorance. Trevor suggested we drive to the clinic to see if we could learn anything more. The receptionist was initially unhelpful, citing privacy laws, but when I mentioned I was supposed to be getting married in 4 hours and showed her the paperwork, she took pity on me. She couldn't share medical details, but she confirmed that someone matching Natasha's description had been a patient there and had been accompanied by a man who definitely wasn't me. Tall, dark hair, expensive suits. We spent the next hour driving around the neighborhood near the clinic, showing Natasha's photo to shopkeepers and restaurant workers. At a small cafe 2 blocks away, the owner remembered her clearly. She'd been there several times over the past few months, always with the same man who matched Connor's description perfectly. The cafe owner even remembered them arguing on one occasion, with the man insisting something had to be taken care of quickly and quietly. The cafe owner mentioned that the mysterious man had paid with a credit card on several occasions. When I asked if they kept receipts, she hesitated but eventually showed me a transaction from 2 weeks ago. The name on the receipt made my world collapse: Connor Walsh, my business partner and supposed friend. By this point, wedding guests were probably starting to arrive at the church, but I was nowhere near ready to walk down any aisle. Instead, I was uncovering a betrayal so complete and devastating that it made me question every relationship in my life. Trevor volunteered to go to the church and handle the situation there, making excuses and buying me time while I continued investigating. I drove straight to Connor's house, a beautiful colonial in the suburbs that our business success had helped him afford. His car was in the driveway, and through the front window, I could see him pacing around his living room while talking on his phone. Something about his body language suggested he was in the middle of a very stressful conversation. I didn't knock. I walked straight through his unlocked front door and found him mid-conversation with someone who was clearly panicking on the other end of the line. When he saw me, his face went white as a sheet, and he immediately hung up. For a moment, we just stared at each other, years of friendship and partnership dissolving in the space between us. Connor tried to play dumb at first, asking why I wasn't at my wedding and commenting on how terrible I looked. But when I slammed the medical paperwork, the cafe receipt, and the parking ticket down on his coffee table, his entire demeanor changed. He sat heavily in his armchair and put his head in his hands, and I knew I was about to hear a confession that would explain everything. The whole story came pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. The affair had started 8 months ago during a business trip to Atlanta where Natasha had accompanied me to a marketing conference. Connor had been there too, and one night when I'd gone to bed early with food poisoning, they'd ended up alone at the hotel bar. What was supposed to be a one-night mistake had turned into months of secret meetings and elaborate deception. They'd been using my work schedule and business trips as cover for their relationship. The $5,000 had been Connor's contribution to pay for the procedure because he wasn't ready for the responsibility of a child. Brooke had discovered the affair when she'd unexpectedly stopped by Natasha's office one afternoon and caught them in a compromising situation. That's why she'd quit as maid of honor. She couldn't bear to stand by and watch me marry someone who was living a complete lie. But Connor wasn't finished. He told me that Natasha had been planning to call off the wedding herself, but when Brooke had threatened to tell me everything, Natasha had panicked and decided to go through with the ceremony. Her plan was to manage both relationships secretly, gradually phase me out of her life, and eventually make her relationship with Connor official once enough time had passed. The level of manipulation was breathtaking. Every conversation we'd had about our future, every intimate moment, every plan we'd made together had been contaminated by her parallel relationship with Connor. While I was picking out flowers and tasting wedding cakes, she was planning her real future with someone else and using me as cover for her deception. Connor kept apologizing, claiming he'd never meant for things to go so far and that he'd been trying to end the affair for weeks. But his words felt hollow and meaningless. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was months of deliberate betrayal by two people who'd claimed to care about me while systematically destroying my life from the inside. My phone started ringing, and I could see it was Natasha calling. Connor begged me not to answer, but I picked up anyway. Her voice was shaky and scared, asking where I was and why I wasn't at the church yet. I could hear organ music in the background and the confused murmur of guests who were obviously wondering about the delay. Instead of answering her questions, I simply said her name and Connor's name together in the same sentence, followed by the word clinic. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching on for what felt like forever. Finally, she whispered a question asking how I'd found out and whether I was planning to humiliate her in front of everyone at the church. Even in that moment, faced with complete exposure of her betrayal, she was still primarily concerned about how this would affect her reputation rather than the devastation she'd caused me. I told her I was on my way to the church and hung up without another word. Connor tried to follow me, grabbing my arm and pleading with me to let him explain further, but I shook him off and walked out of his house. The drive to the church felt surreal, like I was floating outside my own body and watching someone else's life fall apart in spectacular fashion. Every traffic light seemed to last forever, giving me time to process the magnitude of what I discovered. My fiancé and my business partner had been having an affair for 8 months. She'd gotten pregnant with his child. They'd terminated the pregnancy together, and they'd been planning to continue their relationship even after our wedding. When I arrived at the church, the parking lot was full, and I could see guests milling around outside, clearly confused about the delay. Some of them waved at me, assuming I was just running late due to normal wedding day jitters. If only they knew what I'd been doing instead of getting ready to marry the woman I'd thought I loved. Trevor met me at the entrance, looking relieved to see me, but obviously concerned about my mental state. I quickly filled him in on everything I discovered at Connor's house, and his face went through a series of expressions that ranged from shock to disgust to something that looked like admiration for my detective work under pressure. Inside the church, I could see that Natasha was in the bridal suite with her mother and sister, probably trying to figure out how to handle the situation now that she knew I'd uncovered everything. The wedding coordinator approached me nervously, asking if we were ready to begin the ceremony, and I realized I had to make a decision about how to handle this publicly. I could quietly call off the wedding and deal with the aftermath privately, sparing everyone the drama and embarrassment. Or I could expose everything in front of the 150 people who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate what they thought was going to be a happy union. Neither option felt particularly appealing, but I knew I had to choose quickly. I asked the coordinator to gather everyone in the sanctuary and announced that I had something important to say before we could proceed. Word spread quickly through the church, and within 10 minutes, all the guests were seated and looking expectantly toward the altar where I stood alone, still wearing my regular clothes instead of my tuxedo. Looking out at that sea of faces, family members, friends, colleagues, people who'd taken time off work and spent money on travel to be there, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. These people cared about me, and they deserved to know the truth rather than some fabricated story about cold feet or irreconcilable differences. I started by thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging that this wasn't the ceremony they'd expected to attend. Then I explained, in simple and direct terms, that I'd discovered some information that morning that made it impossible for me to proceed with the wedding. I didn't go into graphic details about the pregnancy or the clinic, but I made it clear that trust had been broken in a fundamental way that couldn't be repaired. The reaction was immediate and intense. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd like a wave, and I could see people turning to each other with shocked expressions. Some guests started crying, others looked angry, and several seemed to be putting pieces together and realizing they'd suspected something wasn't quite right for weeks. Natasha's family looked mortified, while my own family seemed confused but supportive. I could see my mother whispering urgently to my father, probably trying to process what I'd just revealed. Some of Natasha's friends appeared genuinely surprised, while others had expressions that suggested they'd known more than they'd let on. Natasha herself never appeared in the sanctuary during my announcement. According to Trevor, who'd been keeping an eye on the bridal suite, she'd collapsed when the coordinator told her what I was planning to do and had to be helped out through a side exit by her mother and sister. Connor, who'd apparently followed me to the church, was spotted leaving quickly through the parking lot once word of my announcement began spreading among the guests. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but it was honest chaos rather than the elaborate deception that had been planned for months. Guests didn't know whether to leave or stay. So many of them ended up following us to the reception venue anyway, turning what was supposed to be a wedding celebration into something more like a wake for my relationship and an impromptu support group. People shared stories about their own experiences with betrayal and deception. My college roommate told me about discovering his wife's affair through social media. Trevor's sister revealed that she'd never liked Natasha and had been hoping I'd come to my senses before the wedding. Even some of Natasha's friends approached me privately to apologize for not speaking up sooner about things they'd suspected. The most surprising revelation came from Angela, Natasha's cousin, who finally felt free to tell me what she'd been hinting about at the rehearsal dinner. She'd known about the affair for months, but had been sworn to secrecy by Natasha, who'd threatened to cut off contact with the entire family if anyone told me the truth. Angela had been wrestling with her conscience for weeks, wanting to warn me, but afraid of the family consequences. Over the following days and weeks, the full scope of the consequences became clear. The business partnership with Connor dissolved immediately and messily, requiring lawyers and mediators to sort out assets and responsibilities. Our joint clients had to choose which one of us to continue working with, and several major accounts were lost in the transition. The financial impact was significant, but the emotional cost of losing a decade-long friendship and partnership was even worse. Natasha moved out of our apartment within a week, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind everything we'd accumulated together during our 3-year relationship. According to mutual friends, she and Connor made their relationship official almost immediately, moving in together and making no attempt to hide what had been going on behind my back for months. The wedding vendors were surprisingly understanding about the cancellation. The photographer offered to do a portrait session for me when I was ready to start dating again. The florist donated the arrangements to a local hospital. The caterer let me take home enough food to feed me for a week, joking that at least I wouldn't have to cook while I processed everything that had happened. Brooke reached out to me about a month later through social media, apologizing for the cryptic way she'd handled the situation and explaining her internal struggle. She'd been torn between loyalty to her longtime friend and knowing that I deserved the truth about what I was walking into. She'd finally decided that dropping that hint about the baby was the best way to let me discover the truth myself rather than being the one to directly destroy my relationship. The most unexpected consequence was how the experience changed my perspective on trust and relationships. Rather than making me cynical about love and marriage, it made me more appreciative of genuine honesty and authentic connection. I'd learned to recognize the difference between people who support you and people who manipulate you, between relationships built on truth and those constructed on elaborate lies. 6 months later, I was in a surprisingly better place than I'd been on that wedding day. The business was actually thriving under my sole ownership, freed from the complications of Connor's questionable ethics and poor judgment. I'd moved into a fantastic apartment downtown with a view of the river. Most importantly, I'd started dating someone new, someone who valued honesty and communication above all else, and who found my story more inspiring than intimidating. Trevor often joked that I should consider a career change to private investigation, given how effectively I'd uncovered the truth in just a few hours. But the real skill I developed wasn't detective work. It was learning to trust my instincts when something felt wrong and having the courage to investigate rather than ignore red flags. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the worst day of your life can also be the day that saves your life from making a terrible mistake. If Brooke hadn't broken down and given me that cryptic warning about the baby, I might have married someone who was living a completely different life behind my back. Instead of spending years in a marriage built on deception, I got the chance to build something new and authentic from the ground up. A year later, I received an invitation to Connor and Natasha's wedding. I didn't attend, but I heard through mutual friends that it was a small, quiet ceremony with only immediate family present. Several people who'd been at my almost wedding declined to attend theirs, apparently feeling that supporting their relationship would be a betrayal of their friendship with me. The invitation actually made me laugh rather than feel bitter. They were welcome to each other and to whatever relationship they could build on the foundation of lies and betrayal that had brought them together. Meanwhile, I was building something real and lasting with someone who'd proven her integrity and honesty from day one. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wonder what would have happened if I'd gone through with the wedding despite discovering the truth. The answer is always no. I'd learned enough about both of them to know that their deception would have continued and probably escalated over time. The pregnancy and termination were just the beginning of what would have been years of lies and manipulation. The experience left me with hard-earned wisdom about relationships, trust, and the importance of paying attention when multiple red flags start appearing. It also gave me tremendous appreciation for the people who showed up during the crisis, friends and family members who supported my decision without question and helped me rebuild my life on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable illusions. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.